See him, brother. That's pretty good. I really
Happy
appreciate
birthday.
it.
Thank you, thank
Happy
you,
birthday.
thank you.
Happy birthday
What
to
a way
me.
to celebrate a birthday on the air and the Big Apple.
Yeah, but we got this down as being recorded today, 22nd, but the 9th is your birthday. So
Yeah,
good
so
deal.
how do you want to do this? You want to make
we'll
it seem like if it's live?
We just let it be. Welcome, welcome very much to Conversation, where we're pleased to welcome to the program two people from Boracay, or Puerto Rico, and they're Taino background, or
Taino.
associated with Taino, and that being the peaceful, almost totally peaceful folk who inhabited the Caribbean when Mr. Christopher Columbus landed some 500-odd years ago. And we're going to talk about that and about the developments and so forth. And gentlemen, welcome very much. And if I could, on my far left is Roger Hernandez. And your name in Taino is? And it has a meaning. You told me before.
Yeah, I mentioned that once before on the show. It means mountain wind. It means the wind that comes in from over the ocean and hits the wind and brings everything up.
That's beautiful. That's a beautiful name, yeah. And we got Pablo Rosario.
Yes.
And do you have a name?
Yes.
Or you do. Could you share it with us?
Hagüey.
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 Yes.
Does that have a literal meaning?
Sure.
What does it mean?
It has two meanings.
Yeah.
The first meaning is Hagüey is that first pond that is formed when Mother Earth releases her water, her natural water that comes out of the earth, the springs. That first pond is called Hagüey because the Tainos use that to drink only. And
it was like fresh.
Yes, that's it. That first pond that is
Right.
formed, you know, when the water comes out of the earth.
Yeah,
That's
right.
for drinking
From the
only,
spring,
and they
yeah.
call that Hagüey.
Ah,
And also Hagüey is a very hard tree, which the Tainos use the wood for various, reasons,
and that's in the Taino language?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, it's beautiful. That's
Hagüey.
beautiful. It's a beautiful name and everything. And welcome, gentlemen, really,
Thank you,
very much.
Harold.
Now,
Thank you very much.
we're taping this on September 22nd, and we should be, if all goes well and everything, and one doesn't know why not, should be airing this on October 9, the week of Christopher Columbus.
Right.
And we want to talk about that fact, and the fact that the Taino people, maybe you could share some of the history of that and so forth, that when Christopher Columbus sailed in 1492, he came upon the island of San Salvador, and it was inhabited by absolutely graceful, peaceful people that he described, and Bartholomew de las Casas described as being very, very loving, gracious people. And within a terribly short period of time in the Caribbean, vast numbers of those people were ruthlessly decimated by the Spaniards, right?
Yes.
Is this a broad, general
Yes.
truth? And does it then make one wonder about the validity of the honoring of Christopher Columbus in the eyes of the Taino people? And maybe this is something we could talk about.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, that's all true, except that a lot of these indigenous people, specifically in Puerto Rico, Boricay, they hid in the mountains. They were hiding in the mountains. And that's why today you find more people in the mountain areas with more physical look-alike Taino than on other areas of Puerto Rico.
Really?
So,
Yeah.
so there were some full bloods, I would say, even like into the 1600s. There was still some full bloods from 1493, November 19th, 1493, to the 1600s, going into the 1700s. There was still some full bloods left.
Columbus did visit Puerto Rico on the first voyage,
Second
no?
voyage.
On the second voyage, he did, right? It was that he visited in 93, was it?
Yes,
1493?
November 19th
Yeah.
of 1493.
And the island, do we know then the island was well inhabited?
Oh,
Puerto Rico. We have
yes.
some knowledge of Hispaniola because that was the center, and
Sure.
then San Salvador and
Sure.
Cuba a little
Right.
bit. But
Yes.
Puerto Rico was well inhabited at that time?
Yes, we just had some studies done over there on DNA and a couple other things like that. Their chronics said that it was approximately 60,000, and we have now new evidence that it was more like 1.5 million.
Million and a half?
Taínos
Taínos
on Boricay.
and Boricay.
And Boricay in Puerto Rico.
Oh, that many. That's an
Yes,
awful lot.
yeah.
Tremendous amount
Oh,
of
yeah.
That's a
indigenous
lot.
people throughout
Yeah,
the
but they
Caribbean.
bumped off a lot too, you know.
Yeah.
So when by the time they got around to writing things down, well, just put down 60,000 or 65,000. But that's not so.
Yeah. Well, there are probably conflicting reports, right?
Sure.
Of how many there were.
But these are our latest finds.
Yeah.
Our
And they were of the Taino people?
Yes.
Because they were of the, what do you call, of the Arawak.
Yeah.
Taino was part of the
Descendants.
Arawak
Yeah, sure.
group? Or
Sort-
maybe you could talk
Sort
about
of. It's The Arawaks, who originate from the Venezuelan Atlantic coastal areas of South America, were the last migration group to come up as far as Puerto Rico and possibly up to Florida. But before the Arawaks, there were other migration patterns which consisted of peoples from the Mexican Peninsula, the Yucatan, from parts of Belize, Panama, also too down from Florida, and of course people within our own creation stories who actually originated from the islands. And so, you know, depending on which storyline another is speaking of at any particular time, you get different versions of that. But I think that the archaeologists have been able to, you know, prove and substantiate that the Arawaks were actually the last group to sort of like make inroads and to make a penetration. But
And there was commerce between the people of the Caribbean. Among those people, there was traveling by canoe or something.
Yeah, well, yeah, by canoe, but these were like very big canoes, talking like, you know, 80 men.
Yeah.
When you have 80 men rowing.
Really?
Yeah, because you were talking about these grandfather trees.
Yes, right.
You
right,
see?
The chronicles speak of one boat that held 120 men.
Yeah.
120 men.
Yeah. So when you got
made
100
out of a one tree.
Yes. When you got these guys.
Rosario tree, incredible.
Yeah.
What I was going to say is that when you have 150 men or 80 men rowing at the same time, you get from Puerto Rico to Venezuela in no time, for example, and so forth. So they you know, moving around. For example, we have a cave over there in Arecibo. It's called La Cueva del Indio, the cave of the Indian, where there's over 400 petroglyphs carved into the cave walls, and some of these petroglyphs are Aztec. Some are Mayan, some are Inca, most of them are Taino, but it just to show that they had that trade route going with all these countries. Even in Mexican history, they have the Aztecs had a name for Puerto Rico. I think it was Baneque.
Baneque. Yeah, because there were different languages. Yeah.
Yes.
And the Taino wouldn't understand the Aztec language, I
but
presume,
but they had their ways of communicating also and trading. Sure.
Yeah, right.
That one of the important things about the canoes too, Harold, is that the amount of woods that were found throughout the Caribbean, especially in Puerto Rico, was so highly valued by the Spaniards that it was considered a commodity that was owned and controlled by the Queen of Spain. That that was a profit windfall for her investment within the early explorations, and so it was illegal to cut down these trees because technically the chronicles say that wood belonged to the Queen of Spain. And they used those beautiful gigantic trees for ship masts, which was the most important element of any sailing ship. They had to be able to hold the sails that drove their ships of close to 180 feet, maybe 200 feet. Now canoes were about maybe half, 3/4 of the size of that, made out of one piece of wood. And so you have to be able to at least realize that to get a full sense of what kind of canoe can hold 100 men.
Yeah, it's huge.
Those trees no longer exist, but at that time
they were abundant.
Found throughout the Caribbean.
That would have been throughout the Caribbean, all throughout the
And these
Caribbean,
were some of the hardest woods that are known to man.
Right.
Pine wood, Rosario to Guayacan. Purple heart, Levigitis lignome. It's beautiful woods that the strongest furnitures are made out of. And also parts.
And have these things largely been decimated now?
Yeah, they pretty much farmed it out, but they do exist.
Still have some.
They do still exist. Are they trees that can be like a fir, can be planted? You can have it grow again, or does it take a long period of time for it to grow, or what's the reality on that? You can't tree harvest those kind of trees you're talking about?
You could tree harvest them, but it's going to take many years before you can make a canoe out of it.
I think it's terrible. They took a lot of those pine from Maine and from the New England for the sailing ships, for the clipper ships and things, for the mast, like you said, it was for there. But at least they can begin to grow those, you can grow them.
They did the same
But when
in
they
Puerto
go out
Rico.
and they cut the original forest, they're doing it in the Northwest too.
Well, they did in Long Island.
I mean, it just seems
on Long Island.
Yeah, right. But like out in, they got the redwoods out in the Pacific, and to cut those things, they're 1,000 years old or something.
That's why they're called grandfather trees.
It seems to me sinful somehow, against some sort of sin against some sort of.
It's a living thing, Hal. You know.
Right. So that would be something that in the tradition of the Taino, there would have been a lot of things that those Spaniards were doing in their breed and in their
really
thing
affected,
would have been very seen in the eyes of your ancestors as sinful.
Yes.
Consciousness.
And there was a definite clash between the two.
Yes,
and very abrupt and very unjust.
Yeah, and very unjust. Yeah, Columbus said that these people are so peaceful and so good, they'll be easy to enslave.
That's it.
That's what he said in the Chronicle.
That's what he did.
Kind of thing, because
And that's
they were
what he
that
did.
fine.
That's what he said. That's what he did.
Yeah, that's what. Well, except as I said, maybe I can get it straight too, because we're trying to. This is Christopher Columbus, and this was we were talking before when Roberto Magario was here. We spoke with Roger, and you know, we sort of understand that, you know, you have traditions and so forth, but at least the science understands we sort of all come out of Africa 200,000 years ago in migration. We have different different ideas of creation and everything, but they have that kind of thing. We come out to the Americas, and people are going 95% of the way around the world. They've had all this kind of development, and then it was the meeting up of the east and the westernmost extensions of mankind that was signaled by Columbus.
I would say
in
so.
1492.
Yes.
And he came and sailed. So it was a monumental development, and it was a clash of civilizations.
Yes. Yes, because first of all, he didn't discover nothing. In other words, when he got to Puerto Rico, they already had their own government established over there. They had their leaders, they had their sub-leaders, they had their people that worked the land, they had their doctors, they had everything. So he didn't discover anything, you know.
Well, he discovered it from the Europeans' perspective.
That's what I'm saying.
But there's been a European patina on the world for the last 500 years.
What we call it is el encuentro de los dos mundos. The encuentro is the union of both worlds.
Right, right.
You know, they freaked out when they saw the ball game.
Ball game?
Yes,
The
the Spaniards. No, the Spaniards never saw anything bounce. So that took them out. They said, "Wow, what is something?"
Yeah, we played a game with a rubber ball. Of course, rubber originating from the rubber tree.
Right.
And something that the Spanish had no idea of, could never imagine.
You did this in the island?
Yeah. In fact,
well,
the first
Puerto Rico. That's where they first saw it.
Yeah,
They saw the ball game, and they just was like, "Wow, what is this substance that bounces?"
Yeah, right, okay. What was it like in Puerto Rico when they came? Was it like when you go and you think of the Mayan civilization or the city of Mexico was like a great metropolis for crying out loud. What was it like on Puerto Rico? What kind of life? Were they living in villages, cities? Were they?
No,
what was it like?
villages.
How well do we know what the people in 1493 were living like on the island of Puerto Rico?
They were living in villages. They had their own
was there
social
a central
structure.
city somewhere?
Yes. No, it's not. They weren't cities. They were just, large groups.
Yeah.
They lived in different areas of Puerto Rico. Every group had their chief. They had their sub-chief. And then they had the main chief that controlled the whole island.
There was a chief?
Sure.
Oh, is that a cacique?
Cacique.
Cacique.
Every village had a cacique.
Yeah.
But this was the main cacique. His name was Agüevana.
Agüevana
Yes.
of Boracay.
Of Borique.
Boracay is a Taino name?
Yes.
Word? Yeah.
Borique.
Okay, yeah. And we know pretty
Borique,
well.
yeah.
And the estimates were you said from 60,000 to 1 million.
Yes.
That's a pretty big difference.
I know.
Is there an accepted figure of how many people were there?
We're still working with that, but not too long. I'd say about a year ago, because of all this DNA testing and a whole lot of the things that have been coming out, they came to that conclusion that those figures were wrong, that there were more Tainos here than what has been told to us all these years.
Yeah, the figures that came in suggested there was a much higher propensity for a larger population group than was originally suspected. And so the guys that work out figures, your number crunching guys, they were able to determine mathematically what the original population may have been like.
Yeah.
And that's discounting the numbers that were disseminated by the Spaniards.
Right.
Because the people today, today are a living remnant of that original discounted, decimated population.
Is there a very good record of the horror of it, of the Holocaust of the Taino in Puerto
From
Rico?
our end, especially.
I mean, was it documented? Who documented? Because we had Bartholomew de las Casas wrote well and others, but there was an awful lot of prejudicial keeping records by Spaniards.
Yes.
Did the Taino have writing?
No.
Could they have written it down? And how good a record do we have?
We had in Puerto Rico a building which held all these archives.
Yeah.
And this building burnt down like in the 1800s. What was salvaged from that was put together with living people, you see, that they say, well, what's missing there is this and this and that. So that's what we have up until now. But as far as like your question, when it came down to like the way they were treating the people, and all that. They used even dogs to attack. That was something that, you know, a lot of people don't know. In the war with the Taínos and the Spaniards, they used their horses, they used their swords and everything else, but they also used dogs. They had trained dogs to attack the Taínos.
Yeah,
so,
you
know,
horrors that were written in the Chronicles, including the fact that for every one Spaniard that was affected somehow by Taínos, they would kill 13 Taínos for that one Spaniard. Exactly. And that would symbolize the 13 apostles and that you find in the Bible.
Right.
And so, you know, there were real atrocities that, of course, were given a real Spanish slant. And, of course, anything that...
Everything was given a Spanish slant.
And anything that was given an
anti-Spanish
slant was considered part of the black legend or something that, you know, of course, it never happened. And so
the black legend as far as the Anglos were concerned.
Well, the black legend is something that was a term that was coined during the late 1800s when more literature was coming out on the atrocities of the Spaniards.
Yeah.
And so, of course, the Spanish people, being very nationalistic, felt that, well, they were being singled out for something that probably never happened. And so the Spanish people themselves call any sort of criticism against them as being part of the black legend.
Yeah. And there was this thing, because in South America, you had Latin America was Iberian, you know, it was the colonization, and then in North America was English. And the English tried to say, well, they were barbaric, but we weren't, but there was barbarism on both sides, you know. And, you know...
well, there's the terrible amount of competition amongst the other nations that wanted control of the Caribbean. I mean, it was the entry into the New World. And, of course, with any New World, you know, you have, you know, real sense of new resources, mineral rights, and all kinds of riches that could be, you know, that could be exploited. And, of course, if there are any people that happen to be in the middle of that, well, you know, that's the last thing of any concern to these profiteers, especially that came across the ocean at that time.
Yeah. I wonder, you know, like if we talk about, you know, Prescott wrote for, on Cortez and on Pizarro and on the conquest of Bolivia, of Peru and of Mexico and so forth. Was there any particular book like that, even in English, or something that was, but one that was well researched, or you have these things, as far as the history, the early history of the encounter between the Spanish and the Puerto Rican, that is like a classic that seems to resonate more, you know, to where you can get an accurate idea of what actually happened?
One of the first explorations of Mexico was done right before Pizarro or Cortez even thought about leaving Cuba to go to Mexico, because they weren't given any real right by the King and Queen of Spain to go any further than Cuba. But there was an early expedition that went out into Mexico, and of course that whole expedition was wiped out, and there were 3 or 4 guys that survived that. And it took them almost 10, 12 years to find their way from Mexico all the way down into the Inca territories, where of course they were picked up by another Spanish exploration 12 years later, and those were written as the chronicled accounts of Cabeza de la Vaca.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting story because of the 4 remaining survivors of that trip, of that exploration. There was one guy that settled in amongst the Mexica people in the Yucatan, the Maya, and actually married one of the tribal daughters and became a Mayan tribal war chief that later on went out to fight against the Spaniards. And so, of course, with the Spanish slant, you know, dedicated to preserving the integrity of the Spanish people at that time, you know, they discount a lot of what he did, but the Mayan chronicles also talk about that. So there's a lot of hidden pieces of information that make up the total puzzle. And you know, that particular exploration was a very significant one because, number one, it was the first one, and number two is because it brought out the moral dilemma and this confrontation between the New World and the Old World.
Right.
Written from the Indian, the indigenous perspective.
Right, okay.
And then, of course, coupled by the Spanish Chronicles. So, you know,
I'm not sure who the best records are that we're keeping track from the indigenous people's perspective. I'm just not familiar. But I was wondering about, I was thinking about for Boracay or for Puerto Rico. Well, what is the best source for trying to understand?
Let me just say something about what you just said, Harold. And this is one thing that a lot of people don't realize, and that's that the chronicles found in the courts of Spain, which of course, you know, speak about the early Spanish exploration within the New World, they're really legal documents. And so what you find in the chronicles are really suits. You know, they're lawsuits, one Spaniard against another. And so they're written, they're very legal, technical documents that were used in court to settle claims. And so, you know, it's not really a history. What it is, it's just like the law journal of the day. And so they're really somewhat incomplete, and they don't really furnish the clear or more necessary general picture on what was really happening. It's just
you mean the chronicles?
Yeah, so the chronicles should only be viewed as a very...
Well, how do we get a picture of what was really happening? From where are our sources?
Well, the only thing I can say is that Fray Roman Pane, who was accompanying Christopher, he was one that kept writing all these things that was going on. It took him about 5 years to come out with this, the first book written on the indigenous people. I believe it's called Acontecimientos de los Indios de las Antillas, accounts of the association between the Spaniards and the indigenous of the Antilles. So there, he specifically writes mainly about Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, that at the time was called what we call Española today, because the Taínos were...
I know there was a lot written about Hispaniola, but Pora Kane, I mean...
Yeah, well, in those chronics...
and that's been translated in English?
In English, Italian, German...
So that would be a major source.
Oh, yeah. Well, it was the first book.
And that has an authenticity to it?
Well, then what happens here, then we find Las Casas comes afterwards, maybe a year or something. So he adds to what Ramon had already written, and then he investigated a little more. So right now, a lot of people are referring more to his information, even though this other man was before him.
Well, I think Bartolomeo de las Casas had a more humane, if that's the right take, and a reality take on the atrocities that were going on, and condemned them.
Sure, right.
And that was pretty odd, I guess, by that.
It was very odd because, number one is he was a representative of the Spanish church. Right. And so was Ramon Pane. They were both friars, and they were really commissioned by the Queen of Spain to allow her a policy compromise while they were trying to develop a policy towards the New World. And so they were commissioned as our eyes and ears so that they could present sort of like a religious sort of philosophical viewpoint on the area while the body politic of the royal families of Spain developed the real policy. And so, you know, it's important to recognize that because, of course, anything they would have written could have been accepted or deemed unacceptable to the royal family. Right. And so they served as a real buffer, and a real buffer for the ruling families by giving them that sort of hedgeway. And of course, what, you know, unfortunately, or maybe even fortunately for us, is that a lot of stuff that they wrote about was a total shock to the people in Spain because they just were not prepared to allow that information to be let out. And so, you know, it was on the one hand supported by some people that were able to consciously, you know, realize the unjust transition that was occurring, and was sort of like discounted by the people that did not want that type of information to get out. You know. And so Pane's manuscripts were actually lost, and would have been lost forever if there had not been an Italian version of that translated just after it was published. And so the real accounts of the Pane manuscripts come from an original Italian
Thank goodness for the Italian Renaissance.
And of course, the work that Bartolomeo de la Casa did was also created a sensation back in Spain. And the history of both these gentlemen is very interesting because they were both arrested for the things that they wrote about.
They were arrested because they were seen to be heretics, or they were saying things that were counter to what the people wanted them to do. And then it sort of goes on like the now.
And then the chronicles even suggest that, and then even they were given an opportunity to appeal the charges against them. And of course, they leveled counter charges against the people that leveled charges against them. And so there's like a big legal, a real big legal sort of like sociological perspective on a period of the time based on the lawsuits that had occurred that were documented and chronicled by the powers that be.
Maybe we could put it in perspective a little bit because, you know, you had Europe, so you come up 1500 or so. So this last 500 years or so has decidedly been, since 1500, the Renaissance, that thing going on. Before that, you had the flowering of Baghdad. Islam was in flower. People in Europe were living in caves almost, or they were in absolute, you know, in eclipse. The center of civilization was elsewhere, it was Babylonia or something like that. You had cultures in Tiwanaku, you had cultures in Mexico, and so on. Tiwanaku, 200 BC, they had art and architecture that rivaled anything in the old world. So civilizations come and flow and that sort of thing. But for the last 500 years, it has been, and I'm not sure in a certain sense, a continuation with the United States of America. It's been a European time.
Yes.
It was European expansion. They were expanding to the west into the Americas, and then they expanded into Africa. It was called, and it came to be called into India, to China, and they all over the world. The European influence was really very, very widespread, and has been and continues that way. So it's part of that. So there was a clash of the two worlds, as you say, and we should try and understand that in that kind of term. Was there? You know, we want to stress the fact that what happened to the people of the indigenous people of the Americas, it seems to me, as I try to read history and so forth, particularly in the Caribbean and in some of those other areas, there's no Holocaust that is rivaling what happened to them in those first years in terms of the disasters that's been delivered down, barbarism delivered down on one group of people by another. It sets a standard by itself in terms of the horror of it. It seems to me. Now, am I right, or is it just another chapter in human history where there's been barbarism delivered down one powerful group against another? But the case of the indigenous people of the Americas, it was a standard against which all others could be measured in its barbarism?
I would say so, too.
Yeah, I think that's what's significant about that, Hal, is the fact that it's really the first recorded instance of a massive planned genocide that was supported by a body politic, the royal families, and also two church-sponsored. And so what you have is a real legitimate case of wholesale barbarism that even up until today is wholly accepted as just being part of the consequences. And that's what I think really bothers us the most.
Yes.
And by us, I mean every living indigenous person that still is able to exist today. And, you know, and it says a lot, you know, it's really an unjust transition that people fail to recognize. And even today, right now, we have a group led by one of our elders, Borinquen elder, who lives and works in Hawaii, that's seeking an audience this week, October 9th, with the Pope in the Vatican. And it's to rescind...
Burning of the bulls.
It's to rescind the papal bills, the edicts that were passed along in the early 1490s, which actually allowed the Spaniards to go in and kill people, and because the church made the decision to identify the indigenous people of the New World as heretics. And so, you know, this whole notion of making a genocide just by paraphrasing, you know, the royal decrees as an allowance to legitimize that type of murderous treachery is something that has not been rescinded and something that's, you know, been used as an excuse by everyone for the past 500 years.
Well, they had a long argumentation whether or not the indigenous people of the Americas were human beings. They had a long time deciding, are they human beings or not? And finally that papal bull had to do with that. They are. And that therefore there are these rules. And they were dividing the Portuguese and Spanish territories from there. And remember then, I'm trying to get a sense of history.
The real confusion comes with the fact that at that time the people from Europe had considered anything that was close to nature as being savage. I mean, it's a really simplistic view of saying that, you know, if you live in commune with nature and if you have that balance with the surroundings around you, that makes you savage. And of course, you know, we have
Rousseau, right?
In fact, that really laid the platform for that sort of ideological romanticism of getting back to nature. But at those times, how you have to understand that people in Europe were terrified of nature. They were scared of the dark. They were afraid to walk through the woods.
Well, they just came off the Black Plague. Had been a
the Black Plague. Everything around them was monsters, and you couldn't go out to the ocean because there were sea monsters. You couldn't go into the forest because there were dragons.
Yeah, that's right. And those men that sailed with Columbus were scared out of their wits.
The art shows it, and if you look at any landscape paintings of the period, you'll see that there are unicorns in the forest. You know, there are dragons in the forest, and the whole. The whole fear at that time, based on a lot of superstition, was really.
There might have been a lot of might have been a lot of fear in the human. Like being back to that.
Yeah, but we didn't have those fears because we were in direct communication with our surroundings.
Well, okay, you're not over romanticizing.
We couldn't travel. We couldn't travel over the oceans.
There was some guy from Eden there. You guys were living.
We couldn't travel on the oceans on logs if we didn't know what we were doing.
You think it was? You were, but there were some ferocious things. I mean, look at some of the ferocious things that were done in the New World. You know, cutting out the heart of people up on the top of some of those pyramids. It was pretty ferocious.
Yeah.
The rule
of impaling people,
impaling
them on
that was done in the New World. That was done by people. You had cannibalism that was there. They just saw that cannibalism was practiced in the Southwest of the United States in old days. So these things go, and what I guess I was trying to say is, in a certain sense, probably mankind was probably nervous about a lot of the aspects of nature that went for a long time. Because when you think about it, 200,000 years, we're on the savannah in Africa or something, and here we are, and we're naked, and the cheetahs could run faster than us. You know, we didn't have much protection against anything until we began to develop, and probably most of our life was just getting ate up by leopards.
Harold, is the fact that we celebrated that. In other words, we had ceremonies that helped us understand that, and so we had songs, we had dances, and so it gave us a more direct link with that. Yeah. So it really wasn't something that we terrified and maybe tried to overpower. It's something that we accepted and learned to live with and work with. And
big theme. Big
that made
theme.
a big difference.
But the thing is that then you had Europe coming, and everything after the Enlightenment, all of the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, all of that stuff was following, and the consequences of the fact that the Spaniards came have changed forever.
Yes, sir.
The Caribbean.
Yes.
Now, it was a horror. I've seen figures where the numbers of people because I spent a couple years in Bolivia among the Aymara, and we lived there and so forth, but the numbers of people that were decimated, that the numbers are back to what they were at the time of the Spaniards, of the people that are there. So there's been some recovery in that, that sort of thing. So, but, you know, so there is a continuation in history. But what's the long-term consequences of this? Your name is Rosario.
Yes.
That's a Spanish name. Your name is Hernandez. Yeah, sure. You speak Spanish. It's Spanish. You have a link to... Do you feel a connection to Spanish or to the Spanish tradition and that sort of thing now in Boracay? Or how do you guys deal with that, if you understand what I'm saying?
Yes. Well, obviously, you know, we have Spanish names because of the conquistadors, you know. But spiritually, you know, when you start developing more and more and getting deeper into the spiritual aspect of this whole Taino thing, you start feeling and acknowledging that you are more and more Taino. Because, like he was saying before, this whole thing of being in contact with nature. I mean, here comes a European person. If he sees you, you know, praying to a stone, he's gonna like, what's this guy up to?
I understand. Yes,
you know. But if that worked for these people for thousands and thousands of years, you know, who are you to come and change it overnight? Which is what they did. In other words, like I was going to interrupt before with this whole thing of the Catholic Church being the boss of the whole thing. Like if things weren't done the way they wanted, well, they was, well, in the name of Jesus Christ, I chop off your head.
Or your hand.
Next, in the name of Jesus Christ, I chop off your head. Next. You see, so...
It was a brutal, you know, one of my favorite lines, if I may, one of my favorite lines in all of history or literature is, and I use it all the time, but it's history is a nightmare from which I'm attempting to awaken, James Joyce had Daedalus say. And that was a time when there was open, I mean, there's still, I saw a piece in the Times the other day, slavery, chattel slavery still existed. They had 27 million people that they could identify were in conditions of chattel slavery in the year 2000 on this planet. I mean, it's still there. But in those days, in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, slavery was in full flower.
Oh, yeah.
People were enslaved. People were beaten. People, you know, it was a grim and ugly time.
The Tainos were slaves for, I don't know, hundreds of years before they brought the Africans in there.
Yeah, I know. This thing I said before with Roger is that they had a difficult time. They had a spirit that was difficult to enslave them in the encomienda and so forth. They had these different systems of organizing things, and they had a difficult time with the indigenous people, so they brought the slaves from the Negroes from Africa as slaves.
And other places.
This is a part of the literature that the indigenous would not take to slavery. Is there anything to that?
Well, imagine. This is how the whole thing started with the indigenous
live free or
war.
Die or something, right?
You know, they first of all, when the Spaniards arrived, they thought that they were gods. You know, the Tainos specifically, and that they could just live on forever and ever. They never saw a horse. So that took them elsewhere. Wow, you know, these men ride on top of that animal. So this whole control of the main thing was the gold.
Yeah.
That was the thing. We need people.
Mercantile
Yeah,
era.
we need people to get that gold out of the river
Yeah.
and out of certain caves and certain areas in the mountains. So this whole enslavement thing started, you know, getting the people, you know, like, can I say this on TV?
You can
Angry.
Yeah. Angry.
You know, I think
Pissed off. I
that's
think
the
you
word
meant to
I
say, yeah,
meant
right.
to
Yeah,
say.
you can say that. Yes.
Okay. So with that, they started like saying, well, look, we have to find out what's going on over here with these people.
Yeah.
And it took them a couple of years from 1493 to like, I think 1506 or something like that, when I think it was the chief Urayoan who decided to set a trap for Juan Salcedo. Juan Salcedo was...
Is this in Boracay?
Yes.
Yeah.
He was one of the lieutenants or something like that, some high-ranking officer.
Yeah.
And what they decided to do was to drown him. So they drowned him, and then they watched him, I don't know, for 2 or 3 days. And when they said, this guy he's dead, then that's when they decided, well, we can fight with these people. They died just like us. And that's what started there. See?
Also, too, the fact that the policy then was to bring in enslaved people from other parts of the world was really another tool to displace the original inhabitants to make the wholesale transfer of land much easier. And so, of course, if you know, if you more than triple the population by introducing foreign people, it's much harder to protect what little remains by the very fewer people that are around. Make that argument. But I don't want to mislead people. There really weren't 3 times as many African slaves as there were Tainos. There were never any more Spanish and there were never any more Africans than there were Taino Indians in Puerto Rico.
Really? Is that true?
And I can say that today. There's a DNA study that was just completed that Way spoke about, where in the initial sampling they found that more than 80% of the people that they tested had the Amerindian gene. And so then they...
In Boracay.
Yeah, that was just recently, too.
And then they redid the sampling because they thought that they may have... there were some flaws that were introduced. In essence, they wanted to discount the findings, and so they did a more thorough sampling within the coastal...
And what that
metro. It was above 65%.
65. So,
so even in every instance in which the powers that be tried to dilute the sampling power to skew the numbers, you know, it was much higher than anyone had ever anticipated. And actually, the way we look at it is that the only reason why they did the sampling was because they didn't expect to find any Amerindian gene.
Well, that's the thing. That people have the idea. People have the idea that they were totally wiped out. Well, I think I'm here. I know. I'm glad you are. They have music. They are. But like on Hispaniola, I think they were just wiped out.
Well, in Hispaniola, it had a lot more African slaves introduced. It was a different economy.
That was the center of their thing.
Santo Domingo, Cuba would develop this plantation economies. Puerto Rico never was. It was developed as a presidio. It was a military installation.
A military thing.
That's all Puerto Rico was. It was
El Moro Castle and San Juan.
And that was because the Queen of Spain fell in love with the Tainos from Borinquen.
Right.
Why? See, what is this? What are you talking about? I didn't know of this. I mean, explain.
You got
Isabella?
Queen Isabella fell in love with the Indians.
She liked them, right?
And she knew that there was something terribly wrong with what was about to happen because the King and Queen of Spain had somewhat limited powers. There were royal families throughout Europe that were competing against each other, killing each other off.
Henry
even amongst family, there were brothers that princes that killed brother princes in order to become kings.
Just read Shakespeare.
And Queen Isabella knew that. Queen Isabella recognized that something had to be done, and so the compromise was that that Puerto Rico would be left untouched in a virgin state, but that she would allow the wholesale calamity to occur in other islands, and so she sent Christopher Columbus to create the capital of the New World in Santo Domingo. But they basically left Puerto Rico alone, and so there weren't really that many Spaniards that ever went to Puerto Rico, and really not that very many African
That was like with
slaves.
Bolivia, where I was too. They were the Aymara, that culture
where they
was
were very limited to coastal areas. There really wasn't that much of a penetration, and that there was actually probably a much greater foreign intrusion in the island of Puerto Rico amongst other world powers, because there are a lot of French that went into Puerto Rico. My family is a remnant of that. A lot of Dutch, German, and so Puerto Rico is really a somewhat different, very particularly unique area of the Caribbean.
Interesting. That's really, I didn't realize
take
that.
The name,
it's a gorgeous place.
Take the name, for instance.
No, it is.
Richport. It says
Puerto
it all right
Rico.
there.
Yeah, it does,
You
yeah.
see? And they just like went wild with all the gold that they had
What
there.
does calle mean? That's where I was. Calle in
I
Puerto
really
Rico
couldn't
for
tell you
10
that.
months. That doesn't have a
no.
Taino
That
name.
was
Sure.
the name
Caguas?
of,
Caguas
Sure.
have a meaning? Caguas?
Caguas is the name of a chief.
They were
Caguas
chiefs.
was the chief?
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
Caguas.
What about Calle? Calle was the chief? Or you
The
don't
chief
know?
of Calle had another name.
Yeah, okay.
We're still learning more. I
Yeah,
have a
right. All the
dictionary
time.
of the Taino.
Yeah. Oh, you
language.
do?
Yes, I have a
There
dictionary.
wasn't a written language at the time. There's
No, but with all these years of investigating, they came out with
Yeah.
a dictionary.
Yeah, good.
There have
Great.
been a lot of linguistic studies. I mean, people take it for granted, too, that the people of the Caribbean speak an Arawak language.
Yeah.
And that's not entirely correct. There was
They
just one dialect amongst many. I think there were like 5 different linguistic families that are found in the Caribbean.
All within the Arawak family
Or
of language?
within the Taino family of languages.
Taino is over encompassing that?
Yes,
You had
absolutely.
Lucayan people in
Lucayan people
Lucayan
are the
in
people from the Lucayas,
San
which-
Salvador.
Which means dangerous, reefy areas.
Is that what that means?
That's what Lucayo
They were
means.
fishing
That's a
people.
Taino
Yeah.
word.
I
That's
told
a
you.
Taino
Describe the
yeah.
reef areas. the
Because those were the
coastal
people
areas
that
of the
lived on
Caribbean.
San Salvador that first saw Christopher Columbus.
Yeah, Bahamas.
That was the meeting of the East and the West on that
I think
memorable
too in the
night.
Bahamas still today. That's like a local vernacular term for the natives of the Bahamas. Is,
What?
Lacayans.
Lucayan is a vernacular term for
Yeah.
Taino?
For people now that live in the Bahamas.
The
It's,
people that live
but
in
it's
the...
it's a Taino Indian word.
It's not a name of okay. It's okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's been going on, and so it's a memorable thing. So what are we to make of this and everything? So it's better that they remember those records. The Spaniards came. They've changed everything forever. It's the same thing that happens when you have a culture overriding another culture, isn't it? It seems to be throughout human history a strong technological culture will overwhelm another. But in the case of the indigenous of the America, it was particularly barbaric.
Yeah.
And it should be called to attention.
Oh yes, definitely.
They
definitely.
could take away our wood. They could take away our gold.
They took away your lives.
But they can't take away our spirit. And,
Right.
and one of the main essences, too, of the message that we bring today is that a lot of people also confuse, you know, the historical perspective on our population base by suggesting that we became extinct, which isn't entirely correct, by also suggesting that if we weren't made extinct, well, then we assimilated into the Spanish culture. And that was part of the question that you asked earlier.
In a sense,
And it's not true because...
It's not true? You
No,
don't think?
because what happened in Puerto Rico was that the Spaniards assimilated into the Taino culture. Everything about the Puerto Rican culture is very indicative of the native, natural names and state and consciousness of the island of Borinquen. The names of the rivers, of most of the towns, of most of the things that we do, in and outside of maybe some of the African influences, it's really a very indigenous type of culture. And so the Spaniards, the Tainos never really assimilated into the Spanish customs.
That's right.
It was the
The other way around.
Spaniards assimilated
True?
into the
That's
Taino
it.
customs.
That's it.
Is that right?
That's
Yeah, but Puerto Rico is Spanish now.
Yes,
It's
but
Spanish.
but
You go there,
but
it's-
the
it's
feeling,
American.
Tourist name that they
Yeah.
sell on commercials.
but the feeling that the
they
people
don't got that
have.
mixed up.
But you
Puerto
don't have-
Rico
you
was
don't
really
have-
the name of the port,
But you
and the
don't-
name of the island was San Juan.
But are
Now
there aren't
today-
people? There aren't people living. Taino people living in Puerto Rico. I mean, they live in houses and drive
Yes,
cars.
I
and
understand
do all
that,
that.
but-
when I was in Puerto Rico, the Amara people, they were still living in the villages. I mean, it was very.
Yes.
But you don't
And
have that in Puerto
Bohíos?
Rico.
Boyos.
You don't have that in Puerto Rico.
No,
Well,
but
not
look,
today, the year 2001, but up until 1960, maybe there were a lot more wooden thatch roof houses that we call bohíos,
Okay.
centered around bates and plazas
Okay,
throughout
yeah.
the island.
So what's the overall way you should read Christopher Columbus? This is Christopher Columbus week. It was inevitable. If it hadn't been him,
yeah.
somebody else was going to come over that eastern horizon, and so forth. And how do we judge it? It was Europe. It was a technologically advanced, in a certain sense, Europe that was spreading out all over the world.
Yes.
And it came there. So how do we...
Spiritually
there was no way it could be avoided.
No.
Because if it hadn't happened in 1492, it was going to happen by 1505 or something like
or
that.
1600.
So what do
it
we
was gonna
make of it?
happen.
What do we make of it? We want to call the attention to the barbarism of it?
I would.
Yeah.
I would, because you know, the atrocities that were committed. You know, you come across these people who are humble. They're offering
all of the
everything.
records,
They're
yeah.
giving you. You know,
Yeah.
they're treating you like a god, a king, and all you're doing is constantly stepping on them, abusing them, the women, just going wild, raping women,
Yeah.
all kinds of things like that. You know, and they were fearful. of these men with red beards and all this armor and their dogs and their horses and they're getting drunk and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, lancers.
And their lust for gold.
That was the main thing. That was
they were
material,
really.
Yeah,
Just a bunch of green
but mainly
and
the
this thing you're
gold.
saying about the materialism against the people who had some respect for nature.
Right. Well, there it is. Materialism against spiritualism.
Yeah, that's a big dialectic.
Like I said before, speaking to a stone. But you walk into one of these bohíos and they would have a semi.
What's that?
A semi was a three-pointed figure that they would carve out either in gold, stone, wood, bone, ceramic, and they would represent different gods or spirits.
Yeah.
And this is what I said before. If this semi worked for you thousands and thousands, in other words, if you took a semi for planting the corn, for example, and you plant the corn here, and you also plant the semi in the ground, and you have this whole ceremony that can last from anywhere from a day to 2 weeks or longer of just praying that I have a green thumb, you know, and praying to that semi, and then it works. You have all this abundance of corn. And then next year the same thing, and the same thing. So they feel it's working for us, praying to this stone.
Positive energy.
Exactly, with positive energies.
Yeah, but what happens if you pray to Sami and then it doesn't grow?
Well,
I mean, that had to have happened at times.
Sure. Well,
and what about the attitude of they come and they bring modern agricultural things?
But this came much later on.
To make the thing grow.
This came much later on.
You know, yeah.
We're talking about right then and there, what Christopher saw.
Well, right. Okay, fair enough.
I think what's important for Columbus Week is that this.
Well, I don't know if we got somebody who can operate it.
Right there, sure.
We can't bring it in. Let me do it. Maybe we can bring it just like that's
fine right
we
there.
can't bring it close focus because there's.
I think that the idea, the imagery connected with Christopher Columbus.
Go ahead, bring it in.
Is a lot different than.
That's a picture of Columbus there. Is that?
Yeah, it's a. Let me see if I can focus that. Maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
You can do that.
To the mic.
No, yeah.
It's a lot different than you know. It's a lot different than what actually happened, and I think that people need to realize that. And it suggests that you shouldn't always believe what you hear. If you look at this photo, actually, he looks a lot more like George Washington than he does anything else because they never really did a portrait painting of Columbus.
Yeah.
And so he could look like anybody, but in this instance, in this painting, he looks like George Washington.
Yeah, well, they may have.
And that's because this painting was made at the same time that George Washington was around. This is found in the archives of American Historical Society.
So you're suggesting there was a certain legend built up around it?
Yeah, exactly. So it's an icon that was developed and has been indoctrinated in all the school children of America to sort of accept the romanticized version of this discovery of the New World without recognizing the real atrocities and the real history that had actually
But the discovery of the New World by this advance, let's say that word in quotes, but it's like technology and so forth, was inevitable.
So
there was no way it was not going to happen. You had people that were living with, you know, they had all kinds of technological developments that Europe had, sailing, they could reach out. And that happened not only in the Americas, but it also happened in India. Finally, you had the Raj. You had colonialism. Europeans spread out all over the world. And we've only had that anti-colonial movement in the, you know, since the Second World War, really, that the anti-colonial movement was such that they could push the Europeans back to where they came from. But you didn't have enough force of the indigenous culture that you guys would represent in order to push the Europeans back. Because the European invasion, if that's the right term, from the standpoint of you indigenous people, it's a permanent feature of the Americas. And perhaps only in the Americas, except maybe Australia, right?
You know, I like
but everyone else is being pushed back where they came. But you understand, so this is a...
Yeah, I like to think, though, that societies have progressed today where the level of racism and discrimination is somewhat really well recognized as being a bad form of humanity. It's an unacceptable human trait. And so certainly if these things were inevitable, it's important for us to realize how terribly bad they are to help us deal with and live with the future. Because certainly, I mean, the dynamics of human history will continue to go on until time immemorial own stories say that,
Yeah.
and it makes us better able to deal with each other and establishing and maintaining human relationships.
Yeah, right.
And we were already at that level when Columbus entered into our
Now, which level?
world.
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
And the level of maintaining and establishing and fostering alliances and relationships. We were in the middle of major indigenous trading zones amongst very highly culturalized societies, and we maintained the balance amongst that.
Well, they had trading systems in Africa. They had trading systems in China. They had trading systems in India. They had trading systems in Europe.
Right, and those systems were based on profiting, on wholesale murder, rape, and pillaging.
Well, there was some of that going on in the Americas, too. What I'm trying to say is you don't have all the ingredients of the good in the people in the Americas. There was a mixture among all. You all had.
Yeah, but
there was a better
understanding.
understanding. But trading did not occur in the New World without a ceremonial practice that was celebrated. And also, too, going back to one of your first questions,
that's interesting. Yeah.
the pueblos were really located around those ceremonial centers.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so these towns throughout the Caribbean and also, too, here in the United States, especially in the southern portions, they're really major centers of ceremonial practices that have gone on for thousands of years. They were ideally suited for that because of some spiritual reason, maybe even with the alignment of the planets and the stars, and also too afforded the people that populated those areas with a food source and also too with a source of drinking water.
Yeah,
and so they were highly revered, and the people really cared for that.
Yeah.
That there wasn't the level of pollution or indiscriminate wholesale abandonment. These were areas that were populated for thousands of years that were really well cared for because of the spiritual essence that it brought. And so people came to trade and also to benefit by being in that area at certain times of the year in which that energy flowed onto it. That's why they built the temples of Mexico. Those
well,
had
and the market centers. They had the great market centers. But I'm saying they had those kind of things too. Those market and those ritual things tied in Africa. They had it in Africa.
But there was a highly developed spiritual value to those locations.
Okay, now you're trying to say something. Right.
They were exact astrological locations that were actually even able to be calculated by the Mayans and the Aztecs.
That's right, incredible calculation the Mayan had.
And you got to realize that they had working calendars that the European scholars would not accept.
Now, do we take that thing? That
was in 1492.
Right, I got you.
And 1,000 or 2 more years before that.
Yeah, right. And they had this. They had a mathematical. They had zero. They got the zero in the
Mayan. So there are people today that say that those locations were actual part of a Stargate system. That there's a map. I mean, there's. Obviously, today it's difficult for us, so many years and so many different lives removed from that, to really feel the impact of that. But at some point, I can imagine, and that it meant a whole lot more than we could possibly imagine today.
Okay, then I would ask you this: so that if you were to take that and you say they were advanced in something, and they had, let's say they had the zero, they did. The man had the zero very early, and they had scientific, they were advanced and sort of thing. So that their system is one that is really to be lauded. And in a certain sense, that's like they were in a certain sense spiritually tied in, but also in a certain sense advanced over other civilizations and other cultures, and that we can learn from that in terms of a model for others. But nowadays, in this modern, now we're talking trying to get the lesson of the European and the European connection with other parts of the world. Nowadays, you've got the center of things is the United States of America, and you've got the internet. And you got the and you got the technology, the computers, and the things are all coming out of still the trilateral nations of the world. And do those nations that have that technological advance, are they the ones that have the marketplace kind of context that is the relevant one to which the world should repair, or should we go back to some of the other ones? Do you understand what I'm saying?
The key to that,
the lesson.
The key to that success of those systems is based on a balance that's created within and outside of that. And the key difference that people need to understand is that the indigenous people have always maintained that balance, or at least have attempted to protect that balance.
Yes.
And so when you have these major technologically advanced systems that come in with an imbalance, it's destined to fail.
And that might have been the
very logical way of looking at things, and something that we need to get back to.
All right, that's good.
So-
And then that's what we think before, because we
I'll
said
give you
Europe.
I'll give you an example.
Yeah, and Europe came in technologically advanced in 1492 and wreaked
but
havoc.
morally imbalanced.
And
Right.
morally imbalanced.
That
and
was the main
the
thing.
moral balance
That
is
w-
what we
that's-
maybe need, right?
That's
Okay.
that's the whole
that might
thing
be the
to what
lesson of the-
this is what I was just getting ready
Yeah,
to say. I'm
please.
glad you mentioned that.
Yeah.
The woman in Taino society was put on a pedestal.
Yeah.
You see, for example, her role in society. Also, the Tainos only had 2 rules.
2 rules.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't lie and you don't steal.
What a great thing.
That's it.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's it. If I want something, I want that tie, I'll give you my bracelet.
Yeah.
That's it.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
I don't have to wait for you to fall asleep and take the tie.
Right.
So that was basically their main 2 rules. You don't
Yeah.
lie. In other words, my word, if I tell you I'm going to be here at 9 o'clock in the morning,
Yeah.
I better be here at 9 o'clock in the morning. Otherwise, my word is like a pie crust, very
Yeah.
easily broken.
So the lesson that might come, there are moral lessons from that, and also the idea that there are lessons that the modern world
Needs to
learn
learn from that.
from
That's
the
what- that's-
basic context
that's what
that
we're-
was there
Yeah.
in the Americas with the
That's why.
indigenous
That's
people.
what we project here.
Right.
The moral values, the family moral values. You know, for example, we take care of our elders. You know, we don't do like. You know, I'm just going to speak. You said I can speak, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, it's not like I've seen here where they signal out an elder to stick them up or something like
Yeah,
that. You
uh-huh.
know, that elder was here before you and knows more than you can. You can learn a lot from that elder. So the Tainos had this thing about taking care of their elders
Yeah.
because of they were living schools.
Yeah.
You know, and they would take care of their young ones because they were going to be the future.
Uh-huh.
So by the time a child was about 8 or 9 years old, he knew the whole routine about Tainoism.
Uh-huh.
You know, he knows you get up at a certain time, you take your shower, you bath in the river, you go and pick the yucca, you go and you do this, you get the wood for the fire, you make the canoes, you make this, you know. They didn't talk much.
Uh-huh.
Everyone knew what they had to do in society.
Right. It would have been a feel.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And
Real
as far as like
Yeah.
working the earth,
Uh-huh.
when Ponce de Leon came from Santo Domingo to Puerto Rico, he came through Aguada. That's on the northern western part of Puerto Rico, and Aguada means garden
Okay.
because even from sea, all he could see was just food for as far as he could see.
Mm.
There was just food for miles and miles and miles.
Oh.
They would work, I don't know, maybe 6, 7 weeks out of the year, and then the rest of the year they were off.
Oh. And
You
what,
see-
what was the food? Was it corn or what?
Everything,
Yeah.
everything you could think of. It
Yeah.
wasn't just,
It's like a
you know,
Garden of Eden.
All
Well,
the
this is what I'm
right.
saying.
Yeah, right,
Kids
right.
are not familiar with
Exactly.
corn, tomato,
Right.
everything.
Potato,
everything.
potato, from South
Batata,
America.
Batata, yuca batata,
Pineapple,
pineapple,
Batata?
pineapple.
Yeah,
All
right.
of this is indigenous from
Verduras.
That's right. That's
from
right.
Puerto Rico.
Yeah, that's right.
You
That's
see-
tobacco.
Tobacco, that was another one they
That was the
freaked
worst
out with.
import-
Yeah,
export they had, I think.
they never saw someone smoking in a pipe.
Yeah, I know.
The
yeah.
tobacco we had was more natural and not
Mhm.
Not so addictive?
Yeah, not so addictive with the additives that the RJ, whatchamacallits,
Reynolds, yes, R.J. Reynolds
put,
Company, yeah.
put into the mixture and
Well, yeah.
corrupt
Well, I think there's probably
something that's very sacred medicine to us.
Right.
So
Well, so now our attitude is to really call attention to the barbarity of what
Yes.
actually did go on. We
Yes.
should do that in the name of historical.
recognizing the faults of human nature
Right.
amongst some of us.
Right, right.
Not let that overwhelm the goodness of
and
all of
that
us.
that should apply in a certain sense to other people who have
course,
been so
everybody.
over.
Excellent.
The Jewish people were
Yes.
so
That's
oppressed
all
in the
of it.
30s in Europe and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Or the blacks that were
Yeah.
enslaved.
See, that-
and the
today.
people that have been, these
That's
kinds
the marvel
we
of
should
being a
take-
human being,
yeah.
Hal, is that we have the conscious ability to make that connection between right and wrong, and we need to exercise the goodness of all of that.
Mhm.
Right.
That's what makes us human.
And we might
yeah.
well get some of our models from the people like the Taínos.
Oh, definitely.
from
This is what
everywhere.
happens when you start studying
Some
about
musicians.
Taínos.
Let's talk about some music.
When-
Yeah,
when
I
you
really
start-
can't. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry.
Oh, we're
We
running
didn't
low on
get your
time?
music.
We
We're out.
passed
It's
the
running the
hour.
credits. Sorry.
Okay,
Thank you.
well,
Thank
thank
you. Pablo, Rosario, thank you.
Thank you, Hal, for the
We get it in.
opportunity to-
Thank you for viewing. Tune in again next week. Sorry, we're out of time. time, a really interesting. Happy Columbus Day week and celebrated in the widest dimension of understanding, and Native American week to study it as a combined.
It would have been nice to talk about that statue.
Yeah, well, another.
We fought against a statue for Christopher Columbus.